Hello, welcome back to Life Matters. Well, this is part two of a two-part series with our author, David F. Pierre, Jr. And David has written a book called Sins of the Press, the untold story of the Boston Globe's reporting on sex abuse in the Catholic Church. Well, welcome back, David.
Thank you very much again, Brendan. Thank you so much.
Well, David, I'd like to pick up and ask you a couple of questions here about for instance, we have the Boston Globe had a editor, or the publisher was named Thomas Winship, I believe.
That's right, yeah.
And he had his wife write an advice column. Her name was Elizabeth or Beth.
That's right.
Could you tell us about the advice column for teenagers that for many years called Ask Beth, and how the column fit into the overall story about the Globe?
Yeah, well, having grown up in the Boston area, I remember the column quite well as a teenager coming down and looking at the Boston Globe over breakfast in the morning and so forth. Beth Winship, under the name Ask Beth, had a very popular advice column geared toward the teenage readers in the paper. It was, I think they published it maybe like 2 or 3 times a week. And when we talk about this issue of sex abuse in the Catholic Church, and then also as sex abuse in culture as a whole, if you look back and you kind of look at some of the views from Beth Winship in her column over the years, and see how really the thinking has changed and how the Globe treated this issue of sex abuse and how that has changed over the years. I point out in my book that back in 1980, a 17-year-old wrote to Beth saying that he had been seduced by his high school teacher, and that they had sex and he got his teacher pregnant. Okay, and this clearly under the law would be what we call an abusive situation. A teacher cannot have...
That would be a statutory rape.
Absolutely, it would be.
And this teacher was married, from what I remember in the book.
Yeah, she may have been married, I don't know.
Her marriage was failing or something.
And, so what was Beth's advice? Beth's advice was not that, gee, a horrible crime has been committed. She did not say, gee, this teacher has abused her position and abused you as a person and as a student. Her advice was essentially, well, you got to take responsibility for this, and, there is some fault on your part for, allowing this to happen and so forth. So to me, it's one example from Ask Beth of how this issue of sex abuse has changed from 30 years ago. I also point out in Ask Beth in her column, every once in a while she would respond to the question of, well, what sex ed books do you recommend? And she repeatedly, actually 10 times, repeatedly recommended a book called Girls and Sex, written by a guy named Wardell Pomeroy, who was an associate of the notorious sex researcher Alfred Kinsey. And
from the University of Indiana.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
And if you read some of Dr. Pomeroy's writings on sex, some of it is actually quite troubling, where he minimizes incest, let's say, between fathers and daughters, and so forth. And the book that he recommended kind of downplayed sex abuse, where if an adult came on to a 13-year-old babysitter or something like that this was actually kind of somewhat normal behavior. There's really no treatment of an adult acting sexually towards a minor as abuse. And again, I point out, well, here's the Boston Globe, recommending these authors and so forth.
And this is Beth Winship.
Beth Winship, the wife of the publisher of the Boston Globe. Sure. Yeah.
So she had just free reign. She could do whatever she wanted, basically, I imagine.
I assume so, having such a higher up running the operation, so to speak.
Right.
But again, it points out, the change in thinking over the years, that there were many segments in the media and in the psychological field where this was not treated criminally as it is today. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I want to point out that youth greatly suffered years ago because of that, and they suffer today as adults for the abuse they...
And can I ask you, in your book, you talked about how there was a field of thought that says you can repress all of these terrible things like being raped or raped repeatedly.
Sure.
And that according to other psychiatrists, is completely false, and that you do remember those things.
Yeah, sure.
What is that called? There's a term.
Well, repressed memory.
Repressed
it's a
memory.
Very, very controversial field of thought, which quite frankly has been debunked in the psychological field. And my feeling is that...
But it had an impact during, what, the 1980s, 1990s?
In many of the lawsuits in the 1990s, in the 2000s, and quite frankly, Brendan, even today, there are people saying, gee, I repressed this memory. I had no recollection up until very recently that this had happened to me 30, 40, 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And, the studies in the psychological field say this is not valid. Studies have been done about traumatic situations that people have undergone. And the truth is when people have horrible things happen to them, they actually have trouble forgetting them, okay? It's the opposite. They wish they could forget these horrible things that have happened to them mm-hmm. in the past.
And who is promulgating this? Is it the attorneys that are looking for large court settlements?
Sure. Well, listen, if you have a plaintiff who's suing the church and claiming repressed memory, yes, the plaintiff attorney will put on some doctor, mm-hmm. and I can't help notice these are usually small-time doctors, not well-known, often in fields and so forth, in the field, saying that this is legitimate, and a lot of juries have bought it. Yeah.
Can I ask you another follow-up question to that? Has to do with, I'm going to swing over to another topic here. The Boston Globe, when you talk about hypocrisy in your book, endorsed U.S. Congressman for re-election Gerry Studds after he admitted having sex with a high school boy and then taking him on a trip to Europe.
Yeah. Bostonians will remember this maybe back in the early 1980s, 1983, in fact. A huge story here in the Boston area. Congressman Gerry Studds, who represented a district down on the South Coast in the New Bedford area, admitted taking a high school-age boy, a page, a congressional page, having him over to his apartment in Washington, D.C., having drinks, having sex, also going on a trip to Europe with this same boy and having drinks and sex and so forth. Clearly an abusive situation.
And Congress actually censured him,
didn't they? Censured him, yes he did.
And yet the Boston Globe celebrated him.
1 year later, Brendan, after this episode, Gerry Studds was up for re-election in his district, and indeed the Boston Globe endorsed Studds for re-election.
And why was that? Because he was the first gay congressman to come out?
Well, that could be. He was also a very liberal Democrat. He towed the same line as the Globe editorial board. He was a well-known liberal voice in Congress, so the Globe favored him. Sure.
I want to go back to some of these attorneys that were bringing up the case, looking at the church as a deep pocket, and
sure.
And the settlements were large and really hurt the Catholic Church.
Sure.
We had Rod MacLeish and Michael Garabedian.
Mitchell Garabedian.
Yeah. And you have in your book that they would try to negotiate with the church, saying, my client will keep it quiet if you pay me X plus amount, or we'll let my client. And yet it was really the client wanted to keep it quiet. So these attorneys were basically extracting money out of the Catholic Church with a ploy that was deceptive.
Yeah, there's been a lot of reporting in recent years about quote-unquote secret settlements that the church agreed to with victims. And the way it's told in the media, Brendan, is that it was the church who kind of strong-armed these victims into demanding secrecy from victims. And indeed, these victims were harmed terribly. What happened to them was awful. But this story, this claim that it was the church who was demanding secrecy from victims is not true. In fact, we have learned, as I show in my book, from the lawyers themselves, that they admit years ago that it was their clients, the victims themselves, who demanded secrecy. They were embarrassed about what happened to them. They were rightfully embarrassed. They were deathly afraid of their names being made public and being reported, or people in the neighborhood knowing and all that. They wanted it kept quiet. This is another instance where the thinking has changed nowadays. Victims, rightfully, are more emboldened to speak publicly about what happened to them years ago and in the past about being abused by priests. But this was not the case in the 80s and in the 90s even, when these cases were being litigated. Again, it was the victims themselves who demanded the secrecy.
But you're saying that the press was portraying the Catholic Church as strong-arming or trying to silence the victims.
Sure, and we see that in the movie Spotlight too, and it's the big bad Catholic Church, being cruel and mean to these victims and strong-arming them. And what I try to argue in the book is that was not the case at all. No.
So it was a mischaracterization.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, I wanted to ask you also. You have a chapter in your book, The Globe Sets the Stage for NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. Can you tell us about that, and during what years was this occurring?
Sure. There was a lot of Bostonians might remember back to the late 1970s, a very, very high-profile cases, I should say, of abuse in Revere, just outside of Boston, where you had nearly 24 men rounded up who were found to be meeting at a house or a couple houses in the Revere area and having sex with boys who were reported to be ages 8 to 13, okay? Very, very troubling. And when these cases were finally litigated, in nearly all the cases, Brendan, think of this, boys ages 8 to 13, hardly anyone saw the inside of a prison, of a jail cell. Almost all, in fact, of the defendants received some kind of probation of some kind, or they were ordered to therapy or something like that. It was not treated. I mean, nowadays, these crimes would see several years, if not decades, of jail time.
Well, were they paying money for this? In other words, was it a prostitution per se?
And in fact, that's how prosecutors justified not giving jail time to these defendants. They were saying, well, these boys were given money and drugs and candy and food and whatever and so forth. In exchange for this, we viewed it as more of a prostitution type thing. Of course, the argument is, well, wait a minute, you're still talking about boys, who are 8, 13 years old. Now, at the time of this case, there was a segment, and I don't want to say the entire gay community, but there was a segment of the gay community that saw that these cases were an attack on the gay community and an attack on gays. And there was a man, Thomas Reeves. He was a professor at
right down the street
say,
here
was
at
it
Roxbury Community College.
Thank you, Roxbury Community College. And he argued that there should be that the age of consent should be lowered, and that law enforcement should look upon consensual acts between young boys differently than, let's say, forced acts of sex, which quite frankly flies complete opposite of what we hear today. And the Boston Globe published a prominent article from Reeves with this argument that these are consensual acts between teenage boys and adults, and these should not be acted criminally upon, and that these cases in Revere are a case of an attack on the gay community. I think this article in the Globe emboldened Reeves quite a bit, and as we learn a few months later, in late 1978, Reeves founded the North American, co-founded, I should say, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, NAMBLA, which, of course, became a notorious pedophile group.
Mm-hmm. And can I ask you also about some of the Globe writers over the years? For instance, I happened to see once I went to an Error Society dinner.
Sure.
I think it was at the Hampshire House, and the featured speaker was a guy by the name of James Carroll.
James Carroll,
Can you talk about who James Carroll is and why does he have so much animus towards the Catholic Church?
Sure. Well, James Carroll is an interesting man. He is an ex-priest, and he, emphasis on ex, I would say. He is very, very critical of the church and its orthodox teachings. He's been identified, not just by me, but other writers as well, as an anti-Catholic Catholic, really. Never hesitating to criticize the church on its teachings, especially those related to sexuality. And who has he worked for the past couple dozen years is the Boston Globe. And he's been a reliable, I would say, anti-Catholic voice in the Globe for many years, yes.
And what about Eileen McNamara? There's another Irish name.
Well, again, she is another local writer who has never been afraid of going after the Catholic Church. In the Spotlight movie, there's a scene portraying where the editor sees an article she wrote in July 2001 in response to what the Boston Phoenix had been reporting. And it was this article that McNamara wrote, which the new editor at the Globe saw, Marty Barron. He had just come in from Miami and said, hey, well, why don't we follow up on this Catholic Church sex abuse thing a little more? And that was really the impetus for the 2002 reporting that started in January.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how about Marjorie Egan?
Well, Marjorie Egan worked for many years over at the crosstown rival, the Boston Herald. Mm-hmm. But then again, I would put her almost in the same kind of family as I believe she may be friends with Eileen McNamara and so forth. That a reliable voice criticizing the Catholic Church, especially on its treatment of issues related to sexuality. Yeah, mm-hmm. Sure.
And I know that the Boston Globe has come up with a thing called the Crux.
Crux, yeah.
And you just informed me off camera, and I'd like you to tell the audience who is funding the Crux, or who initially funded the Crux, and now who is funding.
Well, I thought the whole project was very strange, actually. It was about 18 months ago, the Boston Globe had an idea to kind of broaden its brand, so to speak, by beginning a website called Crux, and the tagline is "Covering All Things Catholic." Well, you kind of look a little askew at the Boston Globe with a
given their
website,
decades-long of history of bashing the Catholic Church.
Exactly. So you look at the Boston Globe and the Catholic Church issues, and you're like, you look at it askew. And indeed, I believe Crux was very unorthodox in its approach to the Catholic Church, and I think it gave a reliable platform for many dissenting voices against the Catholic Church. And it's just been reported just in the last couple weeks that the Boston Globe decided to end its support of Crux. It was handed over to its lead writer and its high-profile writer, John Allen, who's a very well-respected Vatican journalist. But John Allen apparently needed some kind of funding and support to kind of keep this going. And the word in the last week is that the Knights of Columbus has teamed up with Crux. And as we speak now, we don't know how this is going to actually appear on the website, but it is something to keep an eye on. I'll leave it at that, because it's, you see what Crux has done as far as giving a voice to so much dissent and so forth, that it's a little bit troubling.
And I wanted to ask you about, perhaps, and this fellow lived in West Roxbury originally, Geoghan. How was his whole situation mishandled? Was it mishandled right from when he entered the seminary?
Well, if you look back in John Geoghan's file, you look at the case of a man who, quite frankly, never, ever should have been a priest to begin with. There are notes back in his file in the seminary that, scholastically he's a problem. He showed some immaturity. They even said something to the effect that he was feminine in kind of behavior and so forth, and that this was someone who, quite frankly, never should have been a priest. And as we tragically learned years later, that he was abusing, that he was sent off to treatment. And here's a case where we talk about the low recidivism rate of priests who went to treatment. This was a case of someone who fell into that 6%, who was treated and yet continue to abuse again. And again, I think the church got some horrible, horrible advice in how to deal with him. What could the church have done, I guess, is the question. If they had removed him from the priesthood, he would have been a private citizen who may have just been, gone off and continued his crimes, or it's a very sad case. It's awful, and the harm he did to these victims is unspeakable. It really is.
The recidivism rate is much higher, as we found out, isn't it?
Yeah. Well,
people were under the belief that send him to a secular psychologist and he can be cured. 94%.
Yeah.
But now we realize the recidivism rate is much higher.
Well, not necessarily. It's you look at the ones who were. There are a number of cases where priests were sent to treatment. They were sent back, and they were found to be not to abuse after treatment. The treatment was successful, but then there is the fear. There is a fear of these men still being in having contact with youth, so forth, and that's something I think that is. Continues to be discussed, but the church has taken the position that indeed, even though they have not abused since their treatment, that they no longer belong in ministry.
Mm-hmm. So. And I want to ask you about Paul Shanley. This was a guy that was celebrated for more than a decade, I think, in the Boston Globe. Can you tell us a little bit about him and what his story?
Sure. Paul Shanley, if you want to think of, let's say...
A Catholic priest.
Right. The 60s Catholic priests, the long hair, not always wearing the collar, so to speak, dressing and working, quite frankly, doing the work which the church is supposed to be doing in ministering to runaways and the gay community and so forth. But what we learned was, years later, was that there was abusive relationships in the work that he did for runaways and in the gay community that he worked with.
Sexually abusive?
Yes, yeah. Oh, absolutely. And again, this was someone who the Globe repeatedly cited over the years when he was a street priest as being a reliable voice criticizing the church for its teaching on sexuality and how its treatment of gay people and so forth. And so again, a very sad case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Finally, one of the writers of the Boston Globe was famous in quoting, "The war is over." Can you tell us what she meant by that and how it?
That was Eileen McNamara, was it not?
I believe so.
Yeah. And she was talking about a group that had a group which many people felt was a dissenting organization giving money to the Catholic Church and the church refusing the money. And her response to this group is to say, the war is over. Basically, you won. The church is weakened. The church is not who it once was. They should claim victory and go home.
That
and
was
to me,
SNAP. Was that SNAP?
actually, it was another group called Voice of the Faithful.
Voice of the Faithful.
Quite frankly, I don't think was very faithful to the church. But
so Eileen McManara was saying, hey, we won.
yeah, and to me,
the church is weakened, and we, the Globe, have won.
And to me, it was very revelatory. It really was. To me, it opened and exposed the mindset of the Globe. Yes, this was a war against the Catholic Church, this reporting of the Boston Globe. And they viewed it as a war, and they view it that they won.
That's very interesting. Well, we hope you enjoyed part 2 of this review of the book called The Sins of the Press, the Untold Story of the Boston Globe's Reporting on Sex Abuse in the Catholic Church. And it comes out at a time where the movie named Spotlight has won an Academy Award, hasn't it, for
Best Picture.
Best Picture. And yet our author today believes that many of the assertions are not necessarily true that the movie portrays. Well, we hope you found today's show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Before we leave, I'd just like to get, how can folks get in contact with you or pick up a copy of this book?
Sure. My website is themediareport.com. Themediareport.com. Check it out.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we hope you found today's show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.